When I was 14, my parents kicked me out of the house. I'd always known they were strict, but I never thought they'd actually go through with it. I mean, what kind of parents throw their kid out over bad grades? But that's exactly what happened. One minute, I was standing in the living room, holding my report card and listening to my dad yell about how I was a disgrace, and the next, I was on the front porch with a duffel bag and nowhere to go. My parents weren't bad people in the usual sense. They weren't abusive or cruel. They just believed in something so strongly that they couldn't see how much damage they were doing. Both of them grew up poor, the kind of poor where you skip meals so your siblings can eat, and they clawed their way out through hard work and sacrifice. Education, to them, was the holy grail. My mom used to say, a good education opens doors, and if you don't take it seriously, you're closing them yourself. She loved that phrase. She must have said it 100 times. But I wasn't Ethan. Ethan was my older brother, the golden child, the straight-A student, the one with the medals and certificates that my mom kept in a special binder like they were precious artifacts. I wasn't dumb, but school wasn't my thing. I struggled to sit still, let alone memorize equations or recite historical dates. I didn't see the point. No matter how hard I tried, my grades never came close to Ethan's, and the comparisons were constant. "Why can't you be more like Ethan?" my dad would ask, shaking his head like I'd personally offended him. I heard it so often it started to sound like my name, not Ethan. At first, I tried to meet their expectations. I studied until my head hurt, skipped playing soccer with my friends, and even gave up my favorite video games. Nothing worked. The harder I tried, the worse it got. My grades started slipping, and my parents started punishing me. No TV, no games, no snacks after school. They even made me kneel on the kitchen floor once for hours, saying I needed to focus on my priorities. It wasn't just the punishments, though. It was the disappointment in their voices, the way they looked at me like I'd ruined their lives by not living up to their dreams. By the time I hit high school, I'd given up. If nothing I did was good enough, why bother trying? I started skipping classes, hanging out in the park instead of going to school. When I did show up, I didn't even pretend to care. I'd scribble random lyrics from songs on my test papers, or write sarcastic answers just to amuse myself. It was stupid, I know, but it felt like my way of fighting back. Things hit rock bottom the day I brought home my freshman report card. It was bad, worse than bad, actually. I'd failed 2 classes, and my GPA was a joke. I knew it was coming, the yelling and the lectures, but I wasn't prepared for how far they'd take it this time. My dad was angrier than I'd ever seen him, pacing back and forth and yelling about how I was throwing my life away. My mom just sat there, silent, her face a mixture of disappointment and pity. And then my dad said it, "You're not our responsibility anymore. If you can't take school seriously, you can figure out how to take care of yourself." At first, I thought he was bluffing, but then he grabbed my bag, stuffed a few of my clothes into it, and handed it to me. My mom didn't stop him. She just looked away. I begged them to let me stay, promised I'd do better, but they wouldn't budge. My dad opened the door and said, "Maybe this will teach you what real life is like." And then they shut the door behind me. I spent that first night on a bench in the park. It was freezing, and all I had was a hoodie and a cheap blanket I'd found in my bag. I didn't cry, though. I was too numb for that. The next morning, when the numbness wore off, it was replaced by something else, anger. They'd given up on me, tossed me out like I didn't matter. Fine. If they didn't care about me, I wouldn't care about them. I didn't have a plan, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. The morning after they kicked me out, I woke up stiff and freezing. The park bench wasn't exactly comfortable, and my back ached from sleeping in the cold. I didn't have a phone or anyone to call. My parents had always kept me too busy with studying to make real friends. For the first time, I realized how isolated I was. But that anger from the night before was still there, bubbling under the surface. I didn't need them. I was going to figure this out on my own. The first thing I needed was food. I had maybe $20 in my pocket, all I'd saved from occasional chores around the house. I bought the cheapest breakfast I could find at a diner, a stale bagel and a watery coffee. It wasn't much, but it kept me going. As I sat there, staring out the window, I overheard the waitress talking to the cook about how they needed more help. Something clicked. I waited until the rush died down, then approached her. "Are you hiring?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She gave me a once-over, her eyes lingering on my wrinkled clothes and tired face. "How old are you?" 16, I lied. She raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. "We could use someone to bus tables and wash dishes. It's not glamorous, but it's work. Pays minimum wage." "I'll take it," I said quickly, relieved she hadn't asked for an ID or anything else I didn't have. That job was the beginning. It wasn't much. I spent most of my time scrubbing plates and sweeping floors, but it gave me something to do and enough money to buy food and, eventually, rent a tiny room in a rundown boarding house. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with peeling wallpaper and a mattress that smelled like mildew, but it was mine. I didn't have to rely on anyone else. At the diner, I kept my head down and worked hard. The regulars started to notice me, and some of them would leave extra tips or offer kind words. One older man, Bill, came in every morning for coffee and eggs. He liked to chat about his time running a hardware store and how he'd built it from the ground up. "Business isn't about the product," he told me once. "It's about people. Treat them right, and they'll stick with you." Something about that stuck with me. I started watching how the waitress, Maggie, interacted with customers. She knew their names, remembered their orders, and always made them feel welcome. People tipped her more because of it. I began to see how much power there was in connecting with people and making them feel seen. After a few months, I felt like I'd hit a plateau. The job paid my bills, but it wasn't going anywhere. I wanted more, though I didn't know what more looked like. One day, Bill mentioned that his friend owned a convenience store downtown and was looking for help. "You're good with people," he said. "You should give it a shot." I followed his advice and applied for the job. The owner, Sharon, was skeptical at first. "You're young," she said, frowning. "This isn't just stocking shelves. You've got to deal with customers, handle the register, and make sure nobody's stealing. Think you can handle that?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. She gave me a week-long trial. It felt like starting over, but I was determined to prove myself. I learned the layout of the store, memorized prices, and paid attention to how Sharon managed things. I even stayed late some nights to help organize inventory. One day, a customer came in looking for something for her kid's birthday party. She seemed overwhelmed, wandering the aisles without much direction. I approached her and asked what she needed. She explained she wanted to put together goodie bags, but wasn't sure where to start. "Let me help," I said, grabbing a basket. I walked her through the candy section, suggested small toys we had on sale, and even found colorful bags to tie everything together. She left with a smile and spent more than she'd planned. When Sharon saw the receipt, she gave me a nod of approval. "You're better at this than I thought," she admitted. That moment was a turning point. I realized I was good at sales, not because I was pushy, but because I genuinely liked helping people. I started suggesting products more often, and customers responded. Sales went up, and Sharon began trusting me with more responsibilities. Working at the convenience store gave me confidence I didn't know I had. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. The lessons I'd learned from Bill and Maggie stuck with me, and I started to believe in myself in a way I never had before. But even as things were looking up, there were moments when the weight of everything hit me. Nights when I lay awake on that lumpy mattress, thinking about my parents and wondering if they ever thought about me, wondering if they felt guilty or if they even cared. I told myself it didn't matter, but the truth was, I still carried that anger and hurt with me everywhere I went. I didn't have a plan for my life yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going back to the person they thought I was. I was going to prove them wrong, not for their sake, but for mine. Working at the convenience store was the first time I felt like I had a purpose. I wasn't just earning a paycheck. I was learning skills that felt meaningful. Sharon started to rely on me more, and soon I was running the store whenever she needed a day off. I learned how to handle inventory, negotiate with suppliers, and even deal with the occasional difficult customer. It wasn't glamorous work, but it taught me a lot about people and about myself. One afternoon, a guy in a suit walked into the store. He was clearly out of place among our usual customers, and I could tell he wasn't there for snacks. He looked around for a bit, then approached the counter where I was stocking gum. "Are you the manager?" he asked. "Not exactly," I said, "but I can help." What do you need? He explained that he worked for a company that sold promotional items to small businesses, things like branded pins, mugs, and tote bags. Sharon had mentioned wanting to get the store's name out there, so I listened to his pitch. He wasn't bad at selling, but I couldn't help thinking I could do it better. By the time he left, I had an idea. That night, I stayed up late researching. I read everything I could about sales strategies, branding, and how to pitch products effectively. The more I learned, the more I realized this was something I could actually do. I didn't need a degree or a fancy resume, just a good idea and the willingness to hustle. The next morning, I pitched the idea to Sharon. What if we started offering local businesses some kind of promotional help? I said, we could act as a middleman, connect them with suppliers, help them design their logos, that kind of thing. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Lucas, I run a convenience store. What do I know about promotions? You don't have to know anything, I said. I'll do the work. You've got connections in the neighborhood. People trust you. Let's use that. To my surprise, she agreed to give it a shot. We started small, reaching out to a couple of local businesses, mostly mom-and-pop shops that didn't have the time or resources to focus on marketing. I helped them design simple flyers and set up social media pages. It wasn't anything fancy, but it worked. Their sales went up, and word started to spread. I'll never forget the first time I walked into a local diner and saw one of my flyers on their counter. It was a cheap, black and white printout I'd made on Sharon's old office printer, but it felt like a masterpiece to me. I snapped a picture of it and couldn't stop smiling for the rest of the day. As the side project grew, I started to think bigger. I'd always figured I'd end up working for someone else, but what if I didn't have to? What if I could turn this into something real, my own business? The problem was, I didn't have much money. Everything I earned went toward rent and groceries, with just enough left over for the occasional splurge, a new pair of sneakers or a meal that didn't come from the store. Starting a business felt impossible, but I couldn't get the idea out of my head. One day, Sharon called me into her office. Lucas, sit down, she said, her tone serious. I thought I was in trouble, but then she slid an envelope across the desk. What's this? I asked. Open it, she said. Inside was a check for $1,000. I stared at it, speechless. It's not much, she said, but I've been watching you. You've got something special, Lucas. You remind me of myself when I was younger, hungry, ambitious. I want to see what you can do with this. For the first time in a long time, I felt tears sting my eyes. Sharon, I don't know what to say, I managed. Say you'll make it count, she said with a small smile. That check was the push I needed. I used it to register a business name, LJ Solutions, and print some basic marketing materials. I set up a website using a free template and started cold calling local businesses, pitching my services. Most of them said no, but a few said yes. My first real client was a florist named Denise who wanted to boost her wedding bookings. I helped her redesign her website, set up an Instagram page, and run a small ad campaign. Within a month, her bookings doubled. Denise was thrilled, and she started telling everyone about me. From there, things snowballed. I landed a small gym, then a boutique clothing store, then a cafe. Each new client brought more referrals, and before long, I was working 7 days a week just to keep up. I hired my first employee, a college student named Mia who was great with graphic design, and together, we started building something real. I moved out of the boarding house and into a slightly better apartment. It wasn't much, but it had a desk where I could work late into the night. Sometimes, I'd sit there and think about how far I'd come. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. But no matter how busy I got, the thought of my parents lingered in the back of my mind. I wondered if they knew what I was doing, if they even cared. Part of me wanted to show up on their doorstep and throw my success in their faces. Another part wanted to forget they existed. I didn't know which part would win, but one thing was certain. I was just getting started. By the time I turned 21, LJ Solutions had grown into something I could barely recognize from its scrappy beginnings. What started as a side hustle born out of desperation had become a legitimate business. We had a small team of 5 people, a proper office, well, more of a shared co-working space, but it felt like a palace compared to where I started, and a steady stream of clients. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, and more importantly, I was proud of what I'd built. That pride fueled me to keep pushing forward, even when things got tough. There were days when deadlines piled up, when a campaign didn't perform as well as expected, or when a client decided to ghost us without paying their final invoice. But every time I hit a roadblock, I reminded myself of where I'd started, on that park bench with nothing but a duffel bag and $20. That memory kept me going. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a call with a potential client, I noticed a notification pop up on my phone, a friend request from my mom. I stared at the screen, unsure how to react. We hadn't spoken since they kicked me out, and now, out of nowhere, she was trying to connect on social media. It felt strange, almost invasive. I ignored the request, but over the next few weeks, my mom's presence started creeping into my online life. She began liking my old posts, photos of me in the office, updates about new clients, even a random picture of my first office chair that I'd captioned. From the bottom to, well, the next step up. It was surreal. Then came the messages. At first, they were simple. Proud of you, Lucas. Looks like you're doing well. I didn't respond, but the messages kept coming, and they started getting more personal. I miss you, Lucas. Please let us know how you're doing. Love, Mom. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to reply, to ask her why she thought it was okay to just pop back into my life like nothing had happened. Another part of me wanted to block her and move on. Instead, I did nothing, letting the messages pile up in my inbox. One night, as I was scrolling through her profile out of morbid curiosity, I noticed a post she'd made about me. It was a picture of my old school photo, the one I hated because my hair looked ridiculous. The caption read, "Lucas has always been so hardworking and determined. We're so proud of the man he's become." I nearly threw my phone across the room. Proud? Of what? They'd thrown me out of the house, cut me off completely, and now they were trying to take credit for my success? It felt like a slap in the face. I vented to Emma, my girlfriend, about it. They don't get to act like they had anything to do with this, I said, pacing back and forth in our tiny apartment. Emma nodded, but her expression was careful. You're right, they don't, she said. But maybe they're trying to make amends. People don't always know how to apologize, you know? Her words stuck with me, though I wasn't ready to admit she might have a point. Instead, I buried myself in work, focusing on a new client we just landed, a mid-sized chain of fitness studios. It was the biggest account we'd ever had, and I threw everything into making it a success. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with another message from my mom. This time, it was different. Lucas, I know we hurt you, and I know we can't undo what we did, but your dad and I would like to see you, even if it's just once. Please let me know if you're willing to meet. Love, Mom. I stared at the message for what felt like hours. It wasn't overly emotional or full of excuses, but there was something about it that felt genuine. For the first time, I felt a flicker of curiosity, not just about why she was reaching out now, but about whether I wanted to let her back in. I showed Emma the message, and she raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to ignore it, but part of me wants to hear what they have to say. Then go, she said simply, but do it on your terms. So, after a few days of deliberation, I messaged my mom back. I'll meet you, I wrote. Just you. No big family dinner, no surprises. Let's keep it simple. She responded almost immediately. Thank you, Lucas. Name the time and place, and I'll be there. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near my office. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray and her face lined with worry. When she saw me, she smiled nervously. Lucas, she said softly, thank you for coming. I sat down across from her, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Anger, curiosity, maybe even a little hope. So, I said, folding my arms. Why now? She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Because we made a mistake, she said. And we've been living with that mistake every day since you left. I wanted to believe her, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily. It's a little late for regrets, don't you think? I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She nodded, looking down at her hands. You're right, she said. It is late. But I'm here now, and I'm asking for a chance to make things right. I know we don't deserve it, but I had to try. Her honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, she wasn't making excuses or shifting blame. She was just owning up to it. And while it didn't erase the years of hurt, it made me pause. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. Not yet, anyway. She looked up at me, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. That's fair, she said. I just hope we can start somewhere. I didn't promise her anything that day, but as I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt something shift, like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. After meeting my mom, I couldn't stop thinking about everything she'd said. The words, "we've been living with that mistake every day," stuck with me, looping in my head at the most random moments. I wanted to believe her, but years of anger and resentment didn't just disappear overnight. I'd spent so long convincing myself I didn't need them that I wasn't sure how to feel about them wanting to come back into my life. A few weeks later, my sister, Chloe, reached out. We hadn't spoken much over the years, not because we didn't care about each other, but because our parents had made it difficult. Chloe had stayed at home, living under their roof and their rules, while I'd been thrown out. She was the perfect daughter, the one who followed their every command. I used to feel sorry for her, but I also resented her for not standing up for me back then. "Hey, Lucas," her text read. "Mom said you met up with her. That's really good to hear. I've been meaning to call, but I didn't know if you'd even want to talk to me." I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. After a few minutes, I typed, "It's not like I was ignoring you. Just been busy." It wasn't entirely true, but it felt easier than admitting I'd avoided her because I wasn't ready to deal with everything. She replied almost instantly. "I get it. Can we meet? I'd love to catch up. No pressure, though." This time, I didn't overthink it. I agreed to meet her for lunch at a small diner downtown. When I walked in, she was already at a booth, nervously sipping a glass of water. She looked different than I remembered. Not in a bad way, just older, like the years had worn her down a little. "Lucas," she said, smiling tentatively. "Chloe," I said, sliding into the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she broke the silence. "You look good. Really good. I've been following your company. It's amazing what you've done." "Thanks," I said, my tone neutral. "How's everything with you?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "It's fine," she said, though her voice didn't sound convincing. "I'm still living at home, working part-time at a library. It's not exactly exciting." I nodded, not wanting to press her, but she must have sensed my curiosity because she kept going. "Mom and Dad, they haven't changed much," she admitted. "They're proud of you, but I think it's because they can brag about you to everyone else. It's still all about appearances with them." Her honesty caught me off guard. I'd expected her to defend them, to try to smooth things over like she always had when we were kids. Instead, she sounded tired, like she'd finally started to see through them too. "I don't know how you stayed," I said, not accusing, just curious. She sighed. "Because I didn't know what else to do. They made it seem like I couldn't survive without them, and I believed it. You were lucky in a way. You had no choice but to figure things out. I wish I'd been brave enough to leave." Hearing her say that hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd blamed her for not standing up for me, for staying quiet when I needed her the most. But now, sitting across from her, I realized she'd been just as trapped as I had been, only in a different way. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you back then," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. "I'm sorry I blamed you for it," I replied. "We were just kids, Chloe. It wasn't your fault." She looked up at me, her expression a mix of relief and sadness. "Thanks for saying that." We spent the rest of the lunch catching up, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in years, it felt like we were siblings again, not just strangers tied together by shared memories. By the time we left the diner, I'd made up my mind to keep in touch with her, no matter what happened with our parents. But before we said goodbye, she dropped a bombshell. "Lucas, there's something you should know," she said, hesitating. "Dad's been sick. For a while now." I froze, my stomach twisting. "How sick?" She hesitated again. Pretty bad. He's not great at talking about it, but it's serious. I thought you should know. I didn't know what to say. For years, I'd pictured my dad as this immovable force, stubborn, harsh, and unyielding. The idea of him being sick, of him being vulnerable, felt almost impossible to process. I don't know if he'll tell you himself, Chloe continued, but maybe it's worth talking to him before it's too late. Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. I didn't know if I wanted to see him, let alone forgive him, but the thought of him being sick left me feeling unsettled. I couldn't ignore it, no matter how much I wanted to. A few days later, I finally decided to text him. Chloe told me you're not doing well. Let me know if you want to talk. He didn't reply right away, and for a while, I thought he wouldn't at all. But later that night, my phone buzzed. His message was short. I'd like that. I stared at the screen, unsure what I was getting myself into. But deep down, I knew I had to face him. Not for him, but for me. When I finally went to see my dad, I wasn't sure what to expect. Chloe had told me he looked different, weaker, but I wasn't prepared for just how much he'd changed. He was sitting in his usual chair in the living room, but the man who used to bark orders and fill the house with his presence now seemed small, almost fragile. "Lucas," he said when he saw me, his voice hoarse. "You came." I sat down across from him, my arms crossed. "Chloe told me you were sick. I figured we should talk." He nodded slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "I don't deserve this," he said. "I know I don't, but I'm glad you're here." For a long moment, we just sat there, the air heavy between us. Finally, he spoke again. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Throwing you out. I told myself it was tough love, that it would make you stronger. But I see now that it wasn't about you. It was about me. My pride, my fears. I let those things hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Hearing him say that stirred something in me. I'd spent so many years replaying the anger, the hurt, but now I just felt tired. "You broke me, Dad," I said, my voice steady but firm. "But I rebuilt myself. Without you." He looked down, nodding. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm proud of you for that. More than you'll ever know." For the first time, I believed him. I stayed for an hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with the past. Work, life, little stories from Chloe. By the time I left, I felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of something I didn't even realize I was carrying. My dad passed away a few months later. We didn't become close, but we ended things on better terms than I ever thought possible. Now, when I think about my parents, it's complicated. They failed me in ways I'll never forget, but I've made peace with it. My life is my own, built from the ground up, and for the first time, I feel free.